Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Katie Howell, WOLA's Assistant Director for Philanthropy, and we're so glad to have everyone here today. First, a big thank you to everyone joining us for all that you do for WOLA. You've helped make this work we're talking today possible, along with much more. Everyone on this call today supported WOLA in one way or another, and we're here today because we all care about human rights in the region and are deeply concerned about this administration's continued threats against asylum seekers. A few housekeeping things. I know we have a few people on the call that are new to the webinar software and the call line. We've muted all of your lines. You'll notice that you can only kind of hear us talking. That's to get rid of some background noise and so that you can hear our speakers better. We are going to have a Q&A at the end of the call. So if you are signed in online and you're able to see the visuals, you'll notice you have a chat box on the right hand of your screen. Throughout the call, feel free to kind of message us any questions you might have that you'd like us to address later in the call. If you're not using your computer, if you're just calling in with your phone, you can go ahead and send questions to Margaret Webster or to me at khouck@wola.org. That's KHOUCK@wola.org. And also let us know if you're having technical issues. We want to make sure you can hear us. Lastly, we did have a number of people who wanted to join but were unable, so we are recording this call so that those individuals can hear the discussion later. As many of you know, this is part of a series of webinars we do for you guys, WOLA's Partners Council, so that you can get the latest on WOLA's work, what we're doing, how it's going, and what's coming up next. So today we are joined by Jeff Thale, WOLA's VP for Programs. We're also joined by Sandra. Sandra Grossman is a prominent immigration litigator and a partner at Grossman, Young, and Hammond. She's also a member of the WOLA Board of Directors. So Jeff and Sandra, you joining us today brings us much needed awareness and attention to WOLA's urgent work to aid immigration attorneys and advocates for migrant rights. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Great. All right, let's get started. So it's clear that the right to seek asylum in this country is under tremendous threat. And just the past few weeks, we've seen Trump attack aid to Central America, even slower processing of asylum requests at ports of entry, and some asylum seekers are now required to wait in Mexico. Before getting into WOLA's project, let's get some context. What's the reality facing migrants and asylum seekers?
Okay, thank you, Katie, and thank you to everyone who's on the call today and who's interested in this very important project. I think that's a really good way to start off the questions here, which is contextualizing this, because there is so much chaos in the news and on a daily basis about the kind of ever-changing policies and then legal challenges to what the Trump administration is doing. And one thing that's clear is that the administration's current policies, which include family separation, the asylum ban, and remain in Mexico, are creating chaos at the border. Rather than focusing on establishing an orderly procedure for processing asylum claims, instead what we have is an attack on immigrant rights to apply for asylum. And that's one of the first things that I wanted to address, which is this actually a right or not? And so the United States is a signatory to important international law treaties like the 1967 United Nations Protocol on Refugees. And what the United States has done is incorporate international law and the definition of who is a refugee into our own national laws, so that a person who arrives at a U.S. border and who is unwilling and unable to return to their country because they fear persecution, either because of their race, their religion, their nationality, because they belong to a particular group, those people have the right to have a credible fear interview before an impartial adjudicator. In this case, it could be an asylum officer that's part of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or to present their case before an immigration judge. And what the Trump administration's policies have done is effectively abrogate that right, which is guaranteed under both international and domestic law. So that, in terms of the context, is important. One of the latest examples of the illegality of the Trump administration's techniques was the Attorney General's decision on April 16th. in a case called Matter of MS. And in that case, basically the Attorney General held that asylum seekers who enter the United States between ports of entry and establish a credible fear of persecution, in other words, they've passed their initial asylum interview, are no longer eligible for release on bond before an immigration judge. So practically speaking, what does that mean? It's going to mean that thousands of deserving individuals who fear persecution in their home country are going to be in detention centers in the United States. Interestingly, a lot of these detention centers are privately funded, so they're for-profit institutions that the Trump administration contracts with to detain immigrants. But additionally, what the decision does is it really overturns very long-standing legal precedent, which establishes that bond decisions are to be made by immigration judges on a case-by-case basis. And what immigration judges have to do is they have to look at a case, they have to decide, is this person a flight risk? In other words, are they not going to show up for their court hearing? And two, do they present a threat to the security of the United States? Again, with this decision, the Attorney General and the Trump administration have really abrogated this right of asylum seekers. They are delaying implementation for 90 days to enter into those contracts, but it's something that's coming in the horizon. And then, the other thing that I really wanted to say, which I think we'll get back to, is that the administration really does have a better choice here. And that's to, instead of putting resources into more detention beds, the other option is to really create a system at the border that provides for the more orderly processing of these cases and provide opportunities for potential refugees to apply from their home countries. And then additionally, what the government should be doing is putting more resources into effectively running these incredibly backlogged immigration courts. So that kind of gives you an overview of, from an attorney's point of view, of where the administration is going.
So let me just jump in to complement that, because I think the flip side, or the complementary side, is to say conditions in Central America have led to a steady increase in the number of people leaving the region and arriving at U.S. borders and seeking asylum or being detained while trying to enter the country, year after year from 2005 to the present. And for a long time, WOLA and others have talked about the situation at the border and said the number of people crossing illegally, crossing without documentation, is at a 45-year low. That's begun to change. And it's begun to change because the majority of people arriving at the U.S. border and being detained are no longer single Mexican men looking for work. They're Central Americans, and increasingly they're families and young children. And that's a really huge and significant increase. As recently as I think 2012, about 10% of people arriving at the border and being held by the Border Patrol were families or children. The numbers it's close to 2/3 in current months. So that's a stunning shift. And it kind of gets to what Sandra was saying about what we're equipped to handle or not. So let me just to back up a second. I mean, those numbers have been going up steadily for a variety of reasons, but increasing problems of gang violence in Central America, the continuing weaknesses of states and their inability to protect people who speak out against violence or abuse, growing problems with domestic violence, all those things have driven the numbers up. They've driven them up year after year, and we're now at this point where at our border we have this significant influx of families and children when what we're prepared for is single Mexican men who can be detained and returned quickly. And so what we need to start thinking about is, on the one side, fixing our asylum system and our border and migration system and adapting to the existing reality. And then on the other side, thinking about what is it that's driving people from the region and what can we do to help create conditions in the region where people don't feel they have to flee. And, just to say for us, that's particularly striking. Our board and friends of WOLA were in Guatemala 10 days ago now. We saw some of this, right? We heard people talk about it, and then we saw in northern Guatemala some of the reality on the ground. And in a migrant shelter, we saw a caravan arrive. I mean, we saw lines of women and kids waiting to get food and water, do some documentation, and then move on toward the U.S. border. And it's a pretty striking reality, and it drives home we need to rethink our approach.
Right. Thank you both. And so with that context in mind, today we really want to talk about WOLA's new resources that help address this problem. So WOLA just recently launched urgently needed, first of its kind, asylum seeker resources. Jeff, can you share more about your work here and how did we get to this point?
Sure. So just a quick general comment. I mean, you know, as Sandra said, the Trump administration's response to this changing reality in the border in the region has not been, let's think creatively about root causes, let's think creatively about the border. It's been, let's build a wall, let's make it tough for people, let's try and compel them not to come, and treat them so badly when they get here that none of their friends or family or anyone else will want to come. So we launched a campaign trying to pull together different elements of our work to look at opposing the construction and spending on a wall, to look at how migrants are treated in transit, to look at the root causes and investment in addressing the root causes in Central America, and finally, to look at how we can be helpful to asylum seekers. And that's what we want to talk about here. So because asylum seekers need to make a case before an immigration judge, and Sandra clearly knows a lot more than I do about this, but need to make a case before an immigration judge that they're facing persecution based on expressions of political opinions and based on country conditions they faced. WOLA and lots of our friends and colleagues get asked all the time to provide affidavits for individual cases. We get, I don't know, between our Mexico team and our Central America team, dozens of requests, probably every week, to respond, and we can't reply. We just don't have the human capacity. And so, but we do have a lot of the information. And what we were able to do is with the Associate Dean at Temple University's Law School, launch a project where law students worked with us to try and structure for asylum attorneys a set of resources about country conditions that were framed in a way that met the legal requirements here and provided them information to help their clients make their case. Mm-hmm. So it's a great project. We formally launched it about a month ago. The students have been working on it for over a year, and let's see, I think we have there it is. It's available on a website. You're all, I think, able to go look at it, and if you let us know, we can give you the secret password so you can enter it. But it provides, and we do that because we want to make sure that asylum attorneys and advocates have it, and that the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't have it, at least right away. But so it provides around some of the major issues: gang violence, gang recruitment, inability of the state to protect people and defend the rule of law. The raw resources that asylum, in both English and Spanish, that asylum attorneys need to help make their cases. So the students gathered a lot of this data. They got their Spanish department to translate a lot of the original Spanish data information into English and put it up there and make it available. And in the, 6 weeks since it's been launched, I think there are 12 to 1,500 people who've entered it to use the material and help to make their case. So it's a great project. It's a continuing project. Temple actually features it when they recruit new law students. They feature this as one of their innovative things. So it's really great.
Yeah. Could you talk about one thing during that process that I found really interesting is the survey process you did? Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. So when we conceived of this, we sort of had an idea of what we thought, based on the affidavit requests we get, attorneys would really need and what we were going to tell the law students to start to focus on. And really, to their credit, they did a survey. They did an online survey of several hundred asylum attorneys from around the country asking, what are the needs you have and what kind of material could we provide that would be most useful to you? And I was very interested. Their priorities were not the ones I thought they would be.
Right.
And so this was one of the nice things, is like a project that's actually based on what people told us would be useful to them. And so their first, set of explorations and research were on those priorities. So.
Sure. And then can you talk more about who is going to be using the resources?
Yeah. So as I say, 1,200 people have accessed it already. Temple disseminated as widely as they can. A number of other law schools that have asylum projects disseminated. The American Immigration Law Association has sent it to all their members. It's gone out really widely, and Sandra, played a big role in kind of helping us push this out.
If I can just jump in there.
Please do.
When Jeff says that the American Immigration Law Association sent it to all of their members, he's talking about 16,000 lawyers. And I'm part of an effort called the Immigrant Justice Campaign, which has over 10,000 non-immigration attorneys taking on pro bono asylum cases that are also using these resources. So it's actually, the reach has been tremendous.
Yeah. For me, too, one of the really great things is there are a set of people who are asylum specialists, and they know asylum law. They've done a lot of these cases. There are a huge number of people around the country who, out of the goodness of their heart, are doing these pro bono, and they've never done an asylum case in their life, and they know almost nothing about country conditions. And this is, for them especially, I think, a really great resource. Yeah. The one other thing that's emerging out of this that we've only started on is there are a lot of people in asylum detention who are going to represent themselves. They don't have an attorney. When you don't have an attorney, your chance of winning your case drops, or put it the other way, your chance of winning your case increases dramatically when you have an attorney. Without it, you're really struggling, and most people lose. And then they go back into the deportation process. So we're doing some work to try and help adapt some of these materials so that next semester they can be available to people who want to defend, for pro se defendants. And that's really great, because pro se defendants, I've heard these accounts. You get, on the one hand, there are people who, they don't speak a word of English. They don't understand our legal system at all, and they're really groping. And there are people who are really smart and really creative and really intuitive and are using whatever web resources are available to them in their detention facility. And you can offer this stuff to people to help them make a much stronger case. So that's really great.
Yeah. Sandra, of course, you're the expert here. Could you tell us what these resources mean for you and for the legal community?
Absolutely. I think what I want to do, Katie, is actually walk everyone through what an asylum case actually looks like. And we just finished a case that has been pending in the immigration system since 2014. So it's a pro bono case that we handled, which basically I went down to Artesia, New Mexico in 2014 to a federal detention center there in order to provide pro bono legal services. And when I was there, I encountered a woman from Honduras and her twin 3-year-olds. And they had just crossed the border. And I met lots of individuals that were in this similar situation. And I can tell you the one thing that I came away with is none of the people that made the trek across the desert in Central America and Mexico with their young children did so because it was a choice. They did it because they didn't have a choice. And that was the case with this young woman that I met and her children. Basically, her partner had been violently murdered, and I'm not going to get into the details on this call, but he had been violently murdered by gang members in Honduras. She had tried to go to the police to lodge a complaint, and the police basically told her to go away, which is consistent with independent reports in that area, which talk about how, in fact, the police system there is corrupt, how many times they are beholden to criminal organizations and gangs themselves. So in the end, this woman and her children were being threatened, and they came to the United States. They spent 6 months in a detention center in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico with very basic access to medical care. In fact, there were medical problems that were not being addressed for her kids. But we were able to provide legal services to her. The judge in that case issued a bond of $20,000, which she couldn't pay.
Yeah.
So she had to stay in detention for the 6 months. And then we presented her case before an immigration judge in Denver. And what I want to make clear is it's incredibly difficult to win an asylum case. You have to show not only a credible fear of persecution, but that the government is unwilling and unable to protect you, and that you're being persecuted on account of what's called a protected ground. So either your race, your religion, your political opinion, because you belong to a group of people that's being persecuted. And Jeff is absolutely right that most people do not win their asylum cases. You really need a lawyer in most cases in order to meet your evidentiary burden. And that's where the WOLA resources, and especially these country conditions reports and the gathering of this information, has been crucial to attorneys that are working on these cases on a pro bono basis. And in this particular case, we actually won the asylum case in 2014 in December, but the government appealed, and we just had a rehearing. This explains to you what the backlog is actually like. Yeah. We just had a rehearing last month, again in Denver. So a case that's been pending for almost 5 years that we actually won. So can you imagine if this person had to actually hire an attorney to babysit their case for 5 years? It's impossible. So we went back and we actually used WOLA's resources as background information to present to the judge to show that this individual was unable to protect herself in Honduras, that country conditions hadn't changed for the better, but in fact for the worse, and we won the case again. We're hoping the government doesn't appeal, but I think that provides a very concrete example of how helpful these resources are, especially in a world of very limited resources. So
that's very helpful. Thank you. So Jeff, as we look at what's next for this project, clearly this is something we want to keep focusing on, both within the Beyond the Wall campaign, but also in expanding how we can be helpful to the legal community. Can you talk about what's next, and then what's next for migrants and asylum seekers under the Trump administration? What should we keep our eye on?
Sure. So in the first round of this, we did a set of resources focused on, Sandra said, state complicity, right? The evidence that shows that Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador are unable or unwilling to help people, to protect people who are facing persecution because of gang violence or another related cause. And then we went on specifically to provide information about gang recruitment of young people, because that's a huge asylum claim, and it's linked to making your asylum case. Currently, they're working on developing resource materials on extortion of small business owners. The huge numbers of people. Extortion is how gangs survive in Central America. It's what they live on, and it's small business people and neighborhoods gangs control who are extorted, and opposing them is a political statement, particularly in a place where the police are likely to be in cahoots with the local clique of MS or 18th Street. So they're doing documentation country by country on extortion of small business owners and what that means and the patterns. And they'll have that, I think, the end of this semester. Over the summer and into the fall, we're going to, on the one side, start adapting some of this materials for pro se defendants, and then assuming we have enough students next semester, we're going to start doing work on Mexican asylum claims.
Oh, wonderful! So, that's great.
Yeah.
So from
on the U.S. side, I mean, the reality here is that the Trump administration is doubling down as they look toward the 2020 elections at anti-immigrant policies. Right? I mean, the Barr decision that Sandra mentioned is an example of that. The president's declared a national emergency and is going to try and build the wall using funds taken from other Pentagon accounts and from disaster relief in the United States. the president announced 3 weeks ago now that in order to punish Central American countries, we were ending all U.S. aid to the region. So, we just made the case that in the long term, it's helping the region address its issues. That's going to slow at least the rate of migration,
Right.
and at least give people choices. We've just sort of walked in the opposite direction from that. In our meetings in Guatemala, we met with the U.S. Embassy, and they're pretty clear. Money from 2017 is stopped. There's no money from 2018. The money from 2019 isn't coming. So the immigration, the administration is on an electorally focused and basically pretty inhumane anti-immigrant agenda, and they're going to keep at it. And we collectively need to push back against that, and we'll be doing so on the border immigration issues, on U.S. aid to the region. I met with the House Foreign Affairs Committee staff yesterday, and they're talking about how to rewrite the laws for the 2020 money so you can't stop it, and how to push back. So there is a lot to do from here in trying to fight back. And it's, it sounds like an abstract political battle, but as Sandra said, you're talking about a family with 3-year-old twins here, that this all means something.
Right.
If I can just jump in there as well, Katie, I had the unique opportunity to travel with WOLA to go to Guatemala just a couple of weeks ago and talk to some of the organizations that are kind of firsthand involved with the flow of migrants, human rights advocacy groups, organizations that help support women who are the victims of domestic violence, and in general, just violence against women. We met with organizations who assist people that have been displaced because of environmental impacts, who are no longer to engage in their traditional forms of sustenance because of droughts or because of floods or because of the imposition of hydroelectric plants. And what I can tell you from meeting with every single one of these people is that the Trump administration's current policies, the only thing that they're going to do is actually exacerbate the flow of migrants coming from Central America to the United States. So it's really unequivocally an incredibly misguided policy. What we need to be doing, instead of putting money into jails for children, right, is to be addressing the root causes of migration, which are corruption, impunity, violence against women, gang-based recruitment. And that's also why I feel so honored to be part of the WOLA board, because this is an organization that's actually addressing the root causes of migration, rather than trying to make this political or put a Band-Aid on all of this.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And so with all of that said, we want to leave time for your questions. We have a few people in the room as well, but if anyone is listening online or on their computer, again, if you're on your computer, you should be able to see a chat box on your right-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to go ahead and type a message out there. If you're calling in by phone, please reach out to Margaret or I. My email is khouck@wola.org. But maybe to kick us off, Sandra, could you talk, under so many challenges, this might not be the most strategic question, but when you look at all of these challenges, what is the most concerning from the Trump administration?
So I'm going to give you a lawyerly answer to that.
Great.
I'm a lawyer.
Perfect.
To me, the biggest challenge that I'm seeing is the erosion of due process rights for migrants, and how the Trump administration is slowly taking away the effectiveness of the immigration courts. So, the immigration courts are in need of reform. I mean, there's no doubt.
Right.
There's a backlog of more than 850,000 cases in deportation proceedings.
Yeah. Wow.
As you saw from the case that I just mentioned, it takes 5 years to get your day in court. That's an untenable system. But again, the role of judges, I think, as we've all seen in this administration, has been crucial to act as a check against this kind of unbridled government power, right? So judges are very important in this day and age.
Yeah.
And what, unfortunately, the way that the immigration courts work is they are under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice. They are not truly independent courts. They're not Article I courts. And so the Attorney General has a lot of power over immigration judges. They can pluck cases away from immigration judges, and the Attorney General can independently decide them and create case law for the rest of the nation that really abrogates immigrant rights, as we saw in the latest decision on April 16th. So, that the independence of judges and the due process rights of immigrants are really at stake. And so I see that as a huge challenge. This administration, not only are they kind of taking these cases and deciding them and overturning precedent, right? They're also imposing numerical quotas on immigration judges, which means that they have to make life and death decisions for people within the span of a couple of hours. And then they're, underfunding these immigration courts, which make it even more difficult for people to have their day in court. So I think that's really the biggest concern on my end.
And we did have a question come in about the Central America aid. So Jeff, you talked about kind of some conversations we had related to that in Guatemala, but realistically, what are the options going forward? What are the options in front of us?
So, good question.
Yeah.
It is really clear that the administration is determined to cut the money, right? They have told AID missions in each Central American country to review contracts that have been signed to see which ones they could break, where the cost of litigation over the broken contract would be less than what they have to pay out. So they're pretty clearly aimed toward cutting the aid. They haven't formally cut the 18 aid yet, and that may be, I think we don't know yet, but the suggestions are they're going to go to the Central American countries and they're going to say, we'd be willing to restore some of this for counter narcotics and immigration control if you will agree to take stricter measures to seal your borders or stop caravans or prevent migration movement. So they may be moving in that direction. I think it's pretty clear that Congress, at least the House, is really upset, to put it politely, about this. The Democratic and Republican co-chairs of the House Foreign Affairs Committee were sitting in the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador talking to the ambassador about the successes of U.S. aid to El Salvador and violence prevention when they got the tweet from the president saying, no more aid. So it's not a surprise that the Democrats are concerned, but the Republican co-chair is concerned, and that's important and positive from our point of view. So I think the question is, Congress can both push back administratively, and it can look at reappropriating the money rescinding and reappropriating the money. And I think we will see some back and forth over the next couple of months between the House, the Senate, and the administration about what kind of agreements they can come to about that. Meantime, the Congress is in the midst of approving money for the coming fiscal year, and I don't have any doubt that they're going to commit the same or larger amounts of money for Central America, and that they're going to do it in a way that takes away the president's ability to suspend it.
How could they do that?
Because current law appropriates the money and says Congress can spend, the administration can spend up to $596 million on Central America. They will rewrite it to say the administration must spend at least, and then they'll specify in greater detail.
I think that will stop Trump.
Well, that's a different question. There may be a legal battle after that, but I think Congress, because for the Congress, this is both an issue about the region, but also it's an issue about authority, right, and congressional prerogative. So we'll see a fight. I think we will see a fight about that. But just to be honest, in the meantime, the reality is program staff violence prevention programs that, while they may be small and local, are doing real things for real kids. are being cut. Domestic violence programs are being cut. We talked to this domestic violence program that lost funding in a sort of previous round of this. So real things are happening to real people, and it will, there isn't any question, it's going to take a long time to recover from this. The result is going to be more people leave. That's just the result.
Oh.
And you know, I don't want to sound negative here. But that's the reality. And what we need to do on the U.S. side is help people gain asylum where they're eligible, fix the asylum system, look at our border and think about better migration policies, and then push back hard, looking toward the future, about how we address the realities in the region.
Mm-hmm. Pat?
How is the first determination made whether a person is coming for asylum or not?
Okay, that's a good question. So what happens is people arrive at the border, and if they indicate to the CBP, to the Customs and Border Protection Officer, that they're afraid to go back to their home country, then by U.S. law, the Customs and Border Protection Officer has to arrange for what's called a credible fear interview. And that means that the individual has to show that there's a significant possibility that they would succeed on an asylum claim. And they're basically interviewed by an asylum officer. They ask them, what are you afraid of? What do you think will happen to you if you go back to your home country? Why is this happening to you? And it's a form that's filled out. And then if they pass their credible fear interview, what would normally happen is those people would be paroled into the United States, which is not, it's a legal fiction. It's not that you've been formally admitted into the United States. It's that you're allowed to come in just for the purpose of presenting your claim before an immigration judge. And really that, and then the whole process begins. And so I think really what WOLA is doing and people in the immigrant rights advocacy arena is just asking that people are given that chance. So if they don't pass the credible fear interview, if they don't win their case before an immigration judge, then they have to go back. But at least they should be given that chance because it's what they're guaranteed under U.S. and international law.
And who are the asylum officers?
The asylum officers are, they're not judges, they're not lawyers, they're people hired by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And so they're the front line. The problem is that, again, rather than putting money into jails, right, what they should be doing is hiring more asylum officers. I mean, these are reasonable alternatives. More asylum officers, more judges to process these claims.
CIS actually, Citizen Immigration Services, used to, I don't know if they do still, they used to do fairly regular trainings for their mid-level staff about country conditions so that they could make informed decisions. I know I've done some of the briefings and other people here have as well. I don't think, new administration, I don't think they're doing that in the way they did. So.
I'm not sure, but what I have been hearing from very credible sources is that in many cases, people express their fear of persecution to a customs officer, and they're told that their case doesn't qualify, that that they don't have a case and that they're not going to be eligible, and they turn them back, and that's illegal, right? The asylum system is nuanced. You can get asylum based on lots of different grounds, and but this is just another measure that the administration is using to deny people this right.
All right, so maybe a final question to wrap us up. What is the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee?
Okay, another good question. So, and there's a lot of confusion about that, actually. Right. An asylum seeker is someone who applies for relief from persecution at a U.S. border, or someone who is already in the United States. For example, people could be admitted on a tourist or a student visa, and then for some reason they can't go back, and then they can apply for asylum. So you have to be either at a border or in the United States in order to apply for asylum. A refugee is someone who is out of the United States. So, for example, this is really one area where the United States should be working with foreign governments in Central America and in Mexico to support programs that allow for the entry of refugees. So there used to be a program called the Central American Minors Program that I think was ended in 2017, that allowed people to, or young people who were being harmed in their own country, were fleeing, gang recruitment or domestic violence, to make a claim as a refugee in their home country and then avoid this dangerous trek to the United States and then the mess that we have at our border, and qualify as a refugee outside of the United States. And it's a great program because it saves resources, right? Anyways, that program was cut off by the Trump administration, and then here we are complaining about more people coming to the United States illegally.
And is there a backlog on that? I saw something from IRAP that there are a lot of those young people who are just kind of in limbo.
My understanding is that they opened the program up, more people applied than they expected. They're only able to process relatively small numbers of them, but there are a lot of kids who filed applications and then they shut the system without resolving it.
That's right. But I did also recently read that those individuals that had been accepted into the program and were not allowed to come filed a lawsuit. And that lawsuit had been decided in their favor by a federal district court judge. Was it? It could have been. Yeah, I just read about that. So that's in the process.
Now they have to find them.
They have to what?
Yeah.
Find those.
Well, right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yep, well, so we are just at 12:45, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time on the call. But, at this point, you might be asking yourself, what can I do? You've taken a really important step by joining us today and also by supporting WOLA and Beyond the Wall. Your support really makes so much of this possible, and we're very, very grateful to you. A second thing you can do that I'll be following up with all of you afterward is you can help us share these resources. As Jeff talked about, we've been partnering with Temple to make sure that this reaches everybody through all the avenues we have. We want to make sure anyone who needs them has them. So I'll be following up with the link. Feel free to share. As Jeff mentioned, it is password protected. So on the homepage of the website, people can submit their email and information about themselves, and then they'll get approved, because we want to make sure that people that have access to it are the ones that should.
There's a secret WOLA password. So if anyone writes to us, we can give you the secret WOLA code.
That's true. We can't give you that as well. So we would so appreciate your help in making sure this reaches all the right networks. And we appreciate all that you do. Sandra and Jeff, thanks for a great conversation. It was really nice to have you guys.
Thank you.
All right. Bye to everyone on the line. Thanks for calling in.